I was welcoming everybody and telling them we're starting, and
good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all in person. It's been such a privilege to be in person these last few weeks. I know there are people who are joining us on Zoom. Welcome to you all too. My name is Megan O'Neill, and I'm Assistant Professor of Art History here at Emory and also Faculty Curator for the Art of the Americas at the Michael C. Carlos Museum. It has been my enormous pleasure and privilege to be the site curator for this exhibition that is coming from the Denver Art Museum, and to be able to work with Marie Watt and Cannupa Hanska Luger. Before I introduce Marie, I want to acknowledge that Emory University was founded in 1836 on the historic lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation. 15 years after the first Treaty of Indian Springs in 1821, dispossessed the Muskogee of land, including both Emory campus locations. I also want to acknowledge that Emory University's founders were slaveholders, and the Oxford campus was originally constructed by enslaved people. To these people and their descendants, I want to acknowledge the grave injustices inflicted on them and recognize the indelible mark of their labor on the creation of this university. I also want to confirm my commitment to working towards more inclusivity within our university, facing our history, both in relation to slavery and land dispossession. And I invite you all to do the same. Next week, there's a big symposium at Emory called In the Wake of Slavery and Dispossession, and you can join by in person or on Zoom, and I welcome you to do so. Okay, now for the wonderful work of today, I would like to introduce Marie Watt, and I have her bio here, and she said, don't worry about reading my bio, they can read that online. But I'll say a little bit. So she's an American artist and citizen of the Seneca Nation with German-Scot ancestry, and her interdisciplinary work draws from history, biography, Iroquois proto-feminism, and Indigenous teachings. She's also an incredibly collaborative artist. Her artwork is based on collaboration, and she's a wonderful person to have conversations with. She has an amazing laugh. Well, I hope you will come to the sewing circle and tell her some stories. Let's all share some stories and get to know each other all a little better. And I hope you have time to look at her amazing work, both here on the screen as she talks about it, also in the exhibition where she is paired with Cannupa Hanska Luger. Marie has an incredible resume, but I would prefer for us to hear from her about her work instead of me reading about all of her amazing background. Anyway, so I just want to welcome you, Marie, and thank you so much for coming to Emory and spending this week with us.
Thank you, Megan. And I want to thank Emory University and the patrons who made this exhibition coming to Emory possible. I also want to thank Elizabeth in the education department who is doing this amazing juggling act of having a live presentation simultaneous with Zoom. I also want to recognize that we're on Muskogee land, traditional land. And I thought I'd start by reading a poem by Joy Harjo. And this was actually suggested to me by a friend in the audience, Anna. So the poem is called Singing Everything. Once there were songs for everything, songs for planting, for growing, for harvesting, for eating, getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, mind break, and war, for death. Those are the heaviest songs, and they have to be pried from the earth with shovels of grief. Now all we hear are falling in love songs and falling apart after falling in love songs. The earth is leaning sideways, and a song is emerging from the floods and fires. Urgent tendrils lift toward the sun. You must be friends with silence to hear. The songs of the guardians of silence are the most powerful. They are the most rare. I've been thinking a lot about singing everything, and at some point in this conversation, I will come back and circle around to this. So I always love introducing my family because they've been people who, in many ways, are not just my parents, but they're my mentors, and they're also my roadies. And so this is Dave and Romaine Watt, and they're helping me with an installation at the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art. And my mom is a member and citizen of the Seneca Nations of Indians, as am I. And my dad grew up in Wyoming on homesteaded land and is an engineer. And my parents met in Seattle, Washington, where they both moved to for jobs. My husband likes to refer to this image as 3 generations of Seneca teeth. It is my mom, my grandmother, and I on the, we're visiting the petroglyph called She Who Watches, and it's on the Washington side of the Columbia River Gorge. So one thing I'd like you to know about me is I come from a matrilineal society, and this image, well, it does look a little bit like George Washington, is called Susan B. Anthony with woodland influences. And I think some people don't know that the suffragists, Elizabeth Jocelyn Gage and, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage were actually located in Seneca Falls, New York, while Susan B. Anthony was sort of roaming the country giving talks. And one thing that's important to understand is that the suffragists actually had relationships with Iroquois women. And some of the rights and customs in my family include women are historically the landowners and are still today. Our clans are passed on through our mothers. I'm from the Turtle Clan. Voting rights traditionally have been the clan mother's responsibilities, although in our particular community, we now have kind of more of a Western democratic voting system. And our enrollment is also through our mothers. And so with the suffragists, they really drew a lot of this wisdom about the freedoms of women from this relationship with Iroquois, or as we call ourselves, Haudenosaunee people. So in our clan system, we have 4 animals that kind of walk the earth and birds, 4 birds. And traditionally, you marry the opposite. So I'm from the turtle clan, and while my husband is not native, his personal moniker is the crow. And so I feel like in some ways we have balance in our family. I was actually trained as a painter. And in 2003, I guess actually just really when I got out of graduate school, I started moving away from the wall and away from paint. And in 2003, I started scavenging for blankets from thrift stores. And at that time, it was kind of that peak of polar fleece. And everybody was buying these polar fleece blankets, and then they were getting rid of their wool blankets. And so it seems crazy today, but like in 2003, I could buy wool blankets for like $5 and under. And I kind of compared it to a tube of paint. And they're really rare tubes of paint now. But one of the things that interested me in working with blankets is that in my family, we give away blankets to honor people for being witness to important events. And in many Indigenous communities, blankets are held in high esteem. And as I started collecting these blankets with this idea of making these kind of totem-like forms that would connect sky and ground, that would reference linen closets, that might reference Brancusi's endless column, or even the conifers of the Pacific Northwest, where I was born and raised. I also quickly learned that when people started observing these blankets accumulated in my studio, which was at my house at the time, or in an installation like this, really the first time I did a public installation with blanket columns, people would say, oh, I used to have a blanket like this. Or it reminded them of a grandmother or a storied blanket in their life. And so one of the things that started happening in these installations is I would put out a book, and there would be a story a story or two in that book. And so people knew how to use the book, if that makes sense. And people would share their blanket stories. And it was kind of incredible because they were really intimate, personal conversations. And I felt that that the work's life didn't end as an object in an institution, but it was, and I won't say end, that doesn't sound right or accurate either, but I realized that there was a conversation that was happening that extended my initial perception of how the piece might act in the world. I always think that a viewer brings their story to an object, I guess. So that's like one thing you should just know. Like, I think that art is for everyone. I don't think you need an art education to have an experience. I think actually having a negative response means that something's talking to you, and I think that's good. So, but in this particular case, I think what was kind of radical and new to me is that it was this call, like it's a call and response, actually. So that this object's gone into the world, and then people are responding with stories, and then those stories like actually end up impacting me. I'm a custodian of those stories, and then they go back out into the world again. So this really has kind of impacted my way forward, and in a way, I'm really interested then in how materials talk and how they're embedded with story. So we're constantly imprinting on these blankets. One thing I like to say is that we're received in a blanket, and we leave this world in a blanket, and all along the way, we're imprinting on these humble objects. I'm looking at the blanket story column on the right, and I'm thinking about how blankets are not square. We think of them as being rectangular. I tend to think of them as being related to our relatives, the sheep, and their wool, of course, goes into, and wool roving goes into making wool blankets. And so blankets have, not only do they have hips, but they actually start to, their hides, right? Like they start to take on the shapes and lumps of the bodies that inhabit them. And so it's really important to me that those, that sense of personality, or what I like to maybe even refer to now as their beauty marks, like that should become evident or visible. That's part of their story. Around this time, I also started working with other materials. You can see carved wood in the foreground and a bronze piece on the left toward the back. The practice evolved to invite people to share a blanket and to contribute a story. And so this was one of the first blanket story columns that was done for the Sakahan exhibition at the National Museum of Canada in Ottawa. And it was not only the tallest blanket story column that I'd created to date, but it was also one that every single blanket in this column had a story connected to it. And simultaneous to making these large collaborative pieces, I'm also making smaller pieces in my studio that I oftentimes refer to as samplers. One thing I love about blankets is I'm looking at the tag on this sampler, and I think it says Wool of the West. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the tags, sometimes they're laundry tags or camp tags with people's names on them, but one of the things I think is so interesting about tags is that blankets are like migratory objects too, right? And they immigrate from different countries. And I think that that's also another part of the story. So here's a story that came in with this. And I think that one of the things you learn, or I learned very quickly, is people aren't just giving, people could give any blanket. They don't have to give their most valued heirloom to the project, but oftentimes people do. And so I love this story because this is the real blanket from James Forrester Benway. He says, I remember the first time my grandfather told me that the blankets came from sheep. And every time we went for a drive into the country, I would look for white and green striped sheep. So one of the things that was sort of amazing in preparing for this project that originated with the curator, John Lukovic, for the Each Other show is it was decided at some point, partly because the institution was trying to borrow a blanket column and there were really none to be borrowed at the moment. So I said, you know what, I will make a new blanket story column for this project. And we did a group call with Denver's community, the Peabody Essex Museum or community, and then also Emory's community. And so it was really this national call. And now it escapes me how many blankets came in, but it was like a lot more than I anticipated, especially considering that the window of time I had for receiving blankets was maybe like a month, right? And so I got a little bit nervous because I thought that this column might exceed the height of the Emory University's Carlos Museum gallery ceiling. And so one of the things that I did with this particular piece is I intentionally folded the blankets with a little larger footprint. So I think of this column as a little bit sturdier, or it has a bigger base. And it's one of the characteristics that's very unique to it. The other thing that's sort of an interesting backstory is that the publication for this piece was going to press soon, and the sculpture had not been built yet because we're still asking for people to participate and collaborate. And so I had to come up with a title. And so I decided that one of the blankets that had come in was about a grandmother. It was actually about a Polish grandmother who had immigrated to the US. She worked in textile factories on the East Coast, and she would save all of these remnants. And then she made these quilts, and everybody in the family has these quilts. And she was very generous with the quilts. She also gave them to, people who were special in the family or the extended family's lives. And so this man has become the guardian or custodian of his grandmother's estate and her blankets. And she's placed them he has placed them in the collections of, I think, the Museum of American Art and the Quilters Museum and different places. And so he gave this project one of his blankets. And so there's another grandmother story, and this is where I wish I had a pointer, but since I don't, I'm just going to come right up to my slide, and I apologize to the people who are not going to follow my body on this, but we're going to say the fourth blanket from the bottom on the right. This blanket right here comes from a participant and a member of Emory's community, and it's Kathy Hannah Amos. And I had the opportunity to just briefly meet Kathy until I was whisked away to another conversation in the gallery during the opening. But one of the things that I loved when I did meet Kathy is that she talked about how there were people in her family that she hadn't been in touch with for some time, and that this blanket has actually, and the gift of this blanket has actually brought these like multiple kind of conversations and kind of reconnecting with one another. And I thought it was really great and serendipitous that it too is a grandmother blanket. So some other things you should know about this blanket column and the name. It's called Blanket Stories, Great Grandmother, Pandemic, and Daybreak. And there's three blankets that came in with very specific pandemic stories. One was about this woman who had a sister who was pregnant, and I think it might have been the first baby to be born in the family. And she decided she was going to knit a baby blanket. And it took multiple attempts to kind of get her knitting up to that final blanket. But she said that in the course of knitting and teaching herself or remembering how to knit, she was basically cocooned in this yarn, and how it gave her comfort in this moment. There's another woman who contributed a blanket that was an extension of a project she had done when the pandemic affected her community. And she became very concerned with houselessness and people who, as a result of the pandemic and losing their jobs, all of a sudden no longer had homes. And so she started making these fleece blankets. And I think she made over 100 during the course of the pandemic. And she contributed one of those blankets to this project. And it has a kind of Star Wars motif, which is funny because I don't know if she knows me, but I'm a person who actually saw Star Wars in the movie theater when it first came out. And I often reference it in my work. But I think what she thought of, and I love this too, is she just really thought of all the kids who could connect with the blanket with this imagery. And then the last story is a person who made some personal protection equipment. And she had all this leftover scraps of fabric after making masks. And she made a quilt out of those masks, or that fabric. And so that blanket is in here too. And then Daybreak, the last part of the title, really relates to me thinking a lot in this moment about Joy Harjo and her poetry and the book American Sunrise. I do want to back up just briefly to the word pandemic, because I think it's also really important to know that, the smallpox pandemic is what impacted, if not wiped out, many Indigenous communities, and the smallpox is a pandemic. And then as I think it's also important to recognize the AIDS pandemic as well. So people who participated in that project received a little limited edition print. They're called pressure prints, and it's the first time I've worked in this way. So simultaneous to this practice of kind of making sculptures, I also have been making these kind of hand-stitched pieces. And it started back in 2003 when I was preparing for a show at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian at their George Gustav High location. And I knew I wanted to hand stitch these pieces, and I quickly realized that there's probably a reason why you can finish only one quilt a year, if that, if you're just doing it by yourself, right? And so I tried some different things, like I tried contract sewing, and I was unhappy with the results, and also it just exceeded what I ever could have afforded. And then I had some sewing circles, or maybe it just started by like inviting a friend over for lunch. I actually was on sabbatical. I was teaching at Portland Community College, and I realized that I didn't have a lot of time for a social life, but if I could feed a friend and they would like stitch with me, then it would be a way of like kind of killing, what is it? Killing two birds with one stone. So the sewing circles started really organically, but very quickly I realized that the sewing circles were not really a means to an end, but a means to what happens when we gather. And what is made is not the piece in front of you, but what is, well, it is made too, but what is really like made for anybody who participates in that exchange is something that we all carry with us. And oftentimes it leads to new relationships and deeper understandings of ourselves in relationship to not just one another, but I think to the world. I think one of the things that I find complicated in talking about the sewing circles is that each person really has to just share what their experience is, but there's not really a way to measure that empirically in the way that funders and different people like to hear sometimes. And that's okay. Like, I'm totally fine with that. But I always prefer it when people can share their own stories. So these are some of the early pieces that were created in my studio at that time. And the sewing circles grew. It used to be that the sewing circle was all just around this like dining room table, like you saw in that previous image. And this is a sewing circle that was held at the National Gallery of Canada. It's funny, it was years after creating that very tall sculpture. And one of the things I love about this image is that it like makes me think of this like Iroquois longhouse with all these people gathered at this long, sharing this long singular table. The participants at sewing circles are as young as 2 and 93. I love stitches by my youngest participants because they oftentimes start to look like constellations. Nothing is removed, but I will tack down things that are more vulnerable and fragile. In this particular piece, there was an image created with tape, and then the tape gets removed and all the panels were stitched back together. And one thing that was so fascinating is that because it was a plaid, you could actually not see where those squares, that grid started to come back together, but that was a happy accident, I suppose. So, you know, the multiple panel concept really came out of working with University of Washington students, where I was an artist-in-resident, and I all of a sudden knew I was going to have 60 students, and I didn't know how to put everybody around one piece. And it just sort of evolved from there. But at that sewing circle at the National Gallery of Canada, there were probably, I would say, over 220 participants in the course of 3 hours. And so that's probably been my biggest sewing circle to date. So this piece is called Butterfly, and it is in the exhibition. And it was actually inspired by being an artist in resident at the Denver Art Museum. And during this residency, we sat around a piece actually called Trek, which is in this exhibition, and I don't think it's in my slide deck. But we were stitching and talking and sharing stories, and some of the people who had dropped in that day were these 2 young women who were powwow dancers. And one danced the jingle dress dance and another danced the fancy shawl dance. And I had hoped, knowing that when I was coming back to Denver that I would be doing a sewing circle again, I had hoped that they might show up at the sewing circle, because I really kind of created this piece in response to hearing their stories. I'm not a powwow dancer, but I think what I love about powwow dancing, and maybe where my work, if it does what I hope it does in the world, what I love about powwow dancing is that there's movement and there's song and there's community, and all your senses are engaged. And there's color, there's so much color. So this sewing circle actually happened simultaneous to the Denver Art Museum's annual powwow. And one of the things that it did to my work, which I think was a really huge and necessary transition, is that it brought it out away from the wall, because I wanted the work to have this sense of movement and be true to the nature of what blankets are in our lives. So this is an installation at Site Santa Fe. And now, something else that's been on my mind. And I feel like my work has always been thinking about this, but maybe in the last couple of years, I started to think what would the world be like if we considered ourselves companion species? And this question really came out of, for me, it came out of the Seneca and Haudenosaunee creation story, which is about Sky Woman. And she falls or is pushed from a hole in the sky. And as she falls, this motley crew, well, first it's birds. These birds help her land on what we now refer to as Turtle Island, but she's helped also by this motley crew of animals. And as a result, we think of animals as our first teachers in our community, and our clan animals also honor this historic relationship. So I started thinking, well, what's the entry point if you just don't think of yourself as related to animals? And I started to think about pets, and then I landed on dogs, although I like to tell people I'm also really a cat person. And then as I often do, I did some research, and I found this image of this she-wolf, and I was struck how this sculpture and this print, this image in front of us is a print, obviously, but I was struck about how her body has become this shelter. We see her ribs, she's emaciated. I tend to think those demigods are a little plump. She, of course, look at that jaw and those eyes. I think we've all experienced this feeling in our lives, but she's exhausted. And I also tend to think that she could become ferocious at a moment's notice. And so I started making work, really thinking about this canine's relationship to our lives, but also the word mother. And I've been thinking a lot about mother, not just in regards to being a biological mother, which I am. I have two daughters who are 9 and 16. But I've really been thinking about mother as what are the characteristics of a mother? How do all humans hold some of those characteristics in us? How can we amplify those characteristics? And part of it is I think that those characteristics are really going to help us move forward and be the stewards that we need to do to pass this place on to future generations. So in listening to this, thinking about this word mother, then I was listen to Marvin Gaye. And it was kind of mind blowing. I'm oh my gosh, mother. Okay, this is just driving me nuts. Sorry, I cannot have that echoing. So I listened to Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, heard it so much as a kid in the 70s in the car stereo. But listening to that song in this moment, I started thinking about that word mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister, father, father. And the song is obviously like really not about just blood family. It is about how we're all related. And so I started thinking about what I like to refer to is this conversation about Marvin Gaye knowledge and Indigenous knowledge about our relatedness. And I think one thing that's important to know is that on the left, you can see Obie Benson, and he is a member of the Four Tops, but he's the person who originally penned the lyrics that then were sort of, I don't know, judged by Marvin Gaye. And one of the things that happened is Obie Benson was like on a bus, and he drove by this protest at People's Park in Berkeley. And I think one thing that's important to know about this moment is not only do we have protests happening against the Vietnam War, there's the occupation of Alcatraz, and there's also the recent assassination of Martin Luther King. So I started incorporating text that not only included mother, mother, and brother, brother, but it also started to include other familial names. And just really thinking about our relatedness. One of the things in this particular piece that I think is important to me is that when Indigenous people signed treaties, it was often signed with an X. X is also, though, a term of endearment. As my youngest taught me, an X is a hug, right? And the O is your kiss. It marks a spot. And so this piece is called Companion Species, We Are Here Now. Around this time, I had this drawing, and I was invited to the Corning Museum of Glass. And we talked about what was possible, and this amazing artist and gaffer, the lead gaffer, Jeff Mack from the Corning Museum. He's like, I can translate that drawing. And so this piece, Companion Species Radiant, was the result, and is also in this exhibition, Each Other. And the funny thing is that this was a collaboration that gave me the nudge I needed to work large. And I really almost did go from something this big, and I'm making this 2 by 4, 3 by 6 inch form, to this 12 by, I don't know, I want to say 12 feet tall by 16 by 9 foot sculpture. Unfortunately, it isn't necessarily a sculpture that's intended to be crawled on, but my kids were on it for scale. And one of the things I was really interested in is like reversing the role of how we see our relationship to animals. So in this case, it's bigger than us. We're invited into its underbelly. Underbellies are very vulnerable spaces. When we share that with one another, you have to like have a lot of trust. It's also a space that has been violated. Okay, let's see if we can get this to go. So this is the piece being constructed in my studio. And we started with a 3D like a model that was 3D scanned. And then we plotted it on a grid and just built each layer. And then after each layer was built, we carved it back. And it breaks down into 20 pieces, weighs about 1.5 tons. I have a fabulous husband, and for many reasons, he's lovely. He's home with our kids right now, but he's also incredible because this sculpture, it breaks into 20 pieces, but it's often stored in our house basement. Yeah, I'm a tough one. It smells glorious. It is red cedar. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to go back. Okay. So You can see it from this other direction. Okay. Talk a little faster. So this piece is called Companion Species Field. And I've always thought that army blankets, in some ways, I think of them as a metaphor for the landscape because they're like created in a way to conceal oneself. And I love all the different greens that come together in this field of army blankets. I will say too, like maybe one of my favorite blankets growing up were these army blankets that my parents probably got from a, what do they call those stores? Surplus store. And we had really a really breezy station wagon. You know, cars were made so much differently then. But those army blankets, they were forts. They were the blanket that my parents would take out to change a tire. They were like, we would ski, and so they'd cover us up like coming down the mountain. I just have such fondness for those blankets. I wish they were still in our lives because I do not think they are. So Companion Species Field, that dog and its tongue was partly inspired by this image by John Singer Sargent. And one of the things that I love about this portrait, and it's, oh no, this is a crime. Okay, so because the most important part of the portrait you can't actually see because we don't know how to get this little piece done. But so what do I do? Click on more. So, so right here, this is like such a brilliant painting, actually. And one of the reasons it's so brilliant is yay. So one of the reasons why it's so amazing, it kind of reminds me of a Vermeer, right? In the way like Vermeer has these like points of light that lead you around the composition. But you hardly see this dog in the lower left-hand corner, but the thing that you do see is your tongue. And for me, that tongue is like kind of another, it's evidence of our relatedness. I have a tongue, dog has a tongue. But also I think for me, it's this call to speak out and speak up for those things and entities that cannot speak up for themselves. And so I want you all to remember that call when we leave here today. This is what the studio looks like sometimes. And it also gives you another sense of scale. And this was a study for the tongue. And so it's actually one of the first times in a long time I'd like brought out my paints, painted, but it's created out of French knots. And one of the things I think is so interesting is how not French knots, but how after creating this piece, like the tongue really looked like a petal to me too. And it's interesting how petals and tongues help bring bodies nutrients, right? So this is called Companion Species, Cosmos, Sunrise, and Flint. And there is something that's sort of tongue-like about this form, but it also, for me, is somewhat megaphone-like. And part of an urgent call. And this piece was commissioned by the Peabody Essex Museum. And it started actually with a series of sewing circles prior to the pandemic, and then was finished in my studio during the pandemic. So one thing I've been thinking a lot about is this word Turtle Island and other teachings and words that are really important in my community. And I set this up actually for a photo shoot for, weirdly, I think it might've been the New York Times or something, but it also is kind of this study for this idea in neon, but I decided to like put tape, this like neon gaffer tape on my shirt and put myself into that word. And in doing that, I started to really think about how like, yeah, I go back to this place. Like we all go back to this place that is Turtle Island. It's this land that we're guests. Eventually I want to do piece that invites people to put tape on their bodies and get themselves photographed in front of this taped piece. I've also recently been working with vintage Italian seed beads, and these beads were recently bought probably off of an auction by a bead seller. But what's interesting to me about them is they were part of a consortium in Venice, the island of Murano, who made beads. And in the early 1900s, in the early 1900s, 1910, they disbanded. And then these beads were just put in storage. And what I love about them, though, is like I can see and remember different Iroquois beaded objects. And I can't help but think that some of these beads, like long time ago, made it over here. And now I'm working with these beads that have this shared thread in common. One thing, I'm so happy for the people who are in the room today. And I also want to just encourage anybody who lives in this community to come to the museum, because I don't think my work translates at all to slides. So this piece, Skywalker Skyscraper, is in the exhibition, and it's called Antipodes, sorry. And it really, this piece in particular actually makes me think about this space, a very particular space. Skywalkers in Haudenosaunee or Iroquois communities are iron workers, and skyscrapers, for me, are these places that are part, they're these buildings that are part of the built environment that our iron workers have worked on. But I also think they're connected to this human desire to reach these kind of unattainable spaces. Okay, I talked about Sing Everything, so I'm going to just pass that. So this is a new piece that has some language really thinking about singing everything. And actually the sewing circle that I'm hosting you today also has kind of a stream of consciousness text that really thinks about what can we sing in this moment. And the work I've been doing most recently also has been meditating a lot on sunrises. And I think that sunrises are so complex because they represent new beginnings and fresh starts. And there's a sunset happening everywhere in the world, or somewhere in the world right now, right? So it's a shared experience. But also the sunsets that we're experiencing are, sometimes their beauty is actually because of what we're doing to the environment. And so they're also really fragile. I put the first image up there because I think sometimes you need to see the floor to get a sense of scale. In my studio, these are, in my studio, we have a hashtag, which is called Dogs for Scale. This is Julep, Min, and on the right is Lenny. Lenny is my pandemic pup. This is a study for a project I want to do in neon. And I think that's really bringing us to wrapping up, but these are the prints that I am sharing today. If you come down and contribute a few stitches. We're here from 1 to 4. So if you wanted to go and see the exhibition afterwards and then come down, we're just you could either go to the first floor and exit, or you could come from the third floor and go out and down the back stairwell. I've been here for, I might be, sorry, I thought I had some images put back in, but I think, oh yes, here's a couple more. So I had the great pleasure of meeting many Emory students. I think we had 70 students or so at Friday's Sewing Circle. And I'll leave you with this one image that I love. So I also decided to have some fun with the text, like what do we need to sing about now? And so two of my favorite editions include tardigrades, because it reminds me of my 16-year-old who did a science project on tardigrades. And this young woman actually on her own, with her own hand, made this embroidered, enlarged tardigrade. It was not part of the text. And so I loved her contribution there. And then, I think that's just, and then the other thing that I included was walrus mustaches. And the story behind that, and maybe people, maybe I'm telling you too much, maybe you have to just come down and ask me, but I'll go ahead since I opened my mouth. Walrus mustaches, I was driving my daughter to school and I saw this man with this giant walrus mustache, and it's like 8 in the morning. It might even be, yeah, it's 8 in the morning. And it just like kind of made me smile. And I think, if you know, well, I think having humor in this piece was also really important. And so I decided to include walrus mustaches, but I also really love that, like, it connects what I'm talking about, right? That like your head can go to walruses and their mustaches, and then it can go to, a man from the 70s or wherever that word takes your imagination. So thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to engaging with you in the hours to come.
If anyone has a question, raise your hand and I will come and bring the microphone to you so that visitors at home can hear the questions.
I have a question about the very tallest blanket column that you made in the Canadian Museum. Is there something in the middle of it that's keeping it from falling over? Okay.
This is a question about the quilts. When you plan it out, and I saw all those triangular pieces, how do you know how many to cut and how do you go about it? It's just phenomenal.
Well, the sun has risen today and it's calling us outside to sew. Thank you so much, Marie.
And we can go into the exhibit.
And the exhibit is also open, so please go into the galleries and enjoy.